Good evening. Good evening, friends, and welcome. My name is Jamie Boskett. I have the privilege of serving as the president and CEO of the Virginia Museum of History and Culture, and it is my pleasure to welcome you all here this evening for our wonderful lecture. Before I introduce tonight's speaker, I would ask you to take a moment just now, if you would, and silence anything you might have that could make noise. And as you're reaching into your pockets, I'll share a few upcoming attractions here at the VMHC. You may not be thinking about this quite as much as we are, but I hope you'll start to be thinking about it regularly. As we gather this evening, we are but 18 months and change from America's 250th anniversary. And you'll hear a lot about this from us because this milestone, we believe, is one we all should embrace. We all, as a community that appreciates history, we all, as a nation, should embrace. And it's a moment that comes perhaps just when we need it most to come together around shared history and shared identity as Americans. The VMHC is really proud to be leading the way in the Commonwealth and well beyond across the nation. Our 250th initiative, which will be in full force in 2025, is in just weeks ahead here, is one of the most robust programmatic efforts of its kind in the country. We will open 2 major exhibitions, travel other displays to some 50 communities across this state. We'll host a wonderful series of lectures and events. We'll support the work of local history museums and historical societies over the next 2 years to the tune of $1 million. We'll publish several new books. And as hopefully you know at this point, we are in the process of launching the largest ever statewide civics education effort in Virginia history. Thank you. So I hope that you'll stay tuned and you'll join us regularly in the months ahead. And of course, I hope you also will consider supporting such a worthy cause. This is a great moment for this institution, having just come through this incredible reimagination and great progress. I'll share with you that just this last month, November, was the single busiest month in the history, the nearly 200-year history of this organization, welcoming some 21,000 people in just a matter of a few weeks. So I think it speaks to, thank you. It speaks to a very exciting period of revitalization and growth and progress. And I think just cements in my mind the value and importance of history. And we should be doing everything we can to continue to inspire the next generation. I'd like to draw your attention just a few particular events that are coming up very proximate in January. On January 15th, we'll welcome ESPN senior editor David Fleming to speak on his new book, Who's Your Founding Father? One Man's Epic Quest to Uncover the First True Declaration of Independence. Hope you'll join us for that. And then on January 25th, we will commemorate the 200th anniversary of the Marquis de Lafayette's Grand Tour of the United States. And you may recall this history, and this is just really interesting. 1824, the Marquis, the last living Continental Army general from the American Revolution, returned to the United States as the nation's guest for his grand tour. And over the next year, in 1824, he was received with a hero's welcome all across the nation in all of the 24, at that time, American states. On January 25th, 1825, as he's nearing the end of that tour, the Virginia General Assembly and other dignitaries, including Chief Justice John Marshall, which you recall not long after this point would become the first president of the Virginia Historical Society, they collectively hosted Lafayette in Richmond for a dinner and ball. So exactly 200 years later to the day, the VMHC will be commemorating this anniversary, this bicentennial dinner, right here at the museum, in partnership with the General Assembly and others, including Lafayette himself and James Lafayette, for that matter. And there are just a few tickets left, but this is a really special night. So I think you'll really enjoy it. So please take a look and consider joining us on that evening, January 25th, for that 200th anniversary. Music, beautiful food, beautiful wine, a great night together. Okay, now on to our program this evening. Tonight's lecture will paint a vivid portrait of André Michaux, one of the most accomplished scientific explorers of North America before Thomas Jefferson sent Lewis and Clark off on their famous expedition. Michaux's work took him from the Bahamas to the Hudson Bay, and it's likely that no other had seen so much of this continent at the time. But there's more to the story. During his decade-long sojourn in America, he found himself at the center of a vast international conspiracy. And as the story winds on, an unexpected figure emerges at the center of the plot, one very well known to all of us here in Virginia, and that is Thomas Jefferson. Joining us this evening to unpack this conspiracy is Dr. Patrick Spero. Until recently, Patrick served as the librarian and director of the American Philosophical Society Library, one of the very oldest history organizations in our nation. And in beginning this January, officially, he will take on the reins of this august organization as its new CEO. Patrick is a scholar of early American history and the author of several articles and 4 books, including Frontier Country, The Politics of War in Early Pennsylvania, Frontier Rebels, The Fight for Independence in the American West, and The Other Presidency, Thomas Jefferson and the American Philosophical Society. And most recently, the work that will form the bulk of his talk this evening, The Scientist Turned Spy, André Michaux, Thomas Jefferson, and the Conspiracy of 1793. I very much appreciate you all taking the time to be here this evening, for your wonderful support of this august institution. And I hope now you'll join me in a very warm welcome for my friend Patrick Spero.
Well, thank you, Jamie, for that very generous introduction. I thought you were done with the clap, and then you went on. And it's great, actually, to be back here. I was reminiscing earlier, my first visit to this site. I was the Virginia Historical Society at the time, was when I was working on that first book, Frontier Country, The Politics of War in Early Pennsylvania. And that book, among other things, studied something called Dunmore's War, which is probably fairly well known with this audience. But I was looking in particular at how Pennsylvania and Virginia were actually in a conflict at the same time over who would control Pittsburgh. Virginia, as it was wont to do, I'm a Pennsylvanian, like to stake claims to a whole vast parts of the country. And they said Pittsburgh was part of Virginia. Of course, Pennsylvania said no, but a lot of records of that was here. But in any case, it's been, over 15, 16 years since I've been here and seen the transformation. And so thank you all for giving me a round of applause. But I have to say, having walked through here today, you all owe Jamie Bosket a huge round of applause for the change that he's implemented here. So I want to talk tonight about my book, The Scientist Turned Spy. I've got all the books conflated now in my head. And what I want to do is talk a little bit first about how I came to write the book that I did, and then share with you some of my findings. So the story of this book actually begins with this document. I should ask by a show of hands, how many people have heard of André Michaux before? All right, a fair number, but not many. So when I was librarian at the American Philosophical Society, it's a large library. It's got a lot of administrative functions. I would say 90% of my job was spent behind the computer screen, behind the desk, glued to the computer screen, dealing with email and various other things. But every once in a while, the greatest part of the job was when we got to take out the treasures and give a tour that showcased the incredible collection that we have at the Philosophical Society. And one of my favorite documents to share was this one. It was the André Michaux subscription list. And the reason I like to share it is because this is a national treasure, which I'll talk about, but it also tells a really interesting story. So what I want to do is share with you what I would tell VIPs who would come to the Philosophical Society for a treasures tour, at least what I would tell them before I wrote this book. And then I will tell you what I say in the book. So to begin, this document is written in 1793. The first half of it is in Thomas Jefferson's hand. At the time, 1793, Jefferson was the Secretary of State, but he was also Vice President of the American Philosophical Society, which was the country's first, oldest, and most distinguished learned society, which had also begun to develop a library around it. The society supported research. And what this shows in this top half is a project that Jefferson was trying to fund. And you can see there, the top portion says, whereas Andrew Michaux was Andre, a native of France and inhabitant of the United States, has undertaken to explore the interior country of North America from the Mississippi along the Missouri and westwardly to the Pacific Ocean. So this is Lewis and Clark, 10 years before Lewis and Clark. That middle section there, where that arrow is, it says, the said philosophical society will raise money. The proceeds thereof will fund this expedition across the Atlantic Ocean. And then what you're looking at beneath there are all the people who supported this project. So Jefferson wrote this, and then he brought it around to all of his friends in Philadelphia to say, I found somebody who wants to take a transcontinental expedition. Will you support it? And here you can see some of the signatures. On the top, George Washington, $100. John Adams, beneath him. In the middle there is Thomas Jefferson, $50. Beneath him is Alexander Hamilton, and above him, you can probably see the Knox. And then to the right is James Madison. So 3 of Virginia's sons are on this, but also the first 4 presidents. So this document is believed to be the only one to contain the first 4 presidents' signatures on it. They all weren't at the Declaration, and they all weren't at the Constitution. Now, the most remarkable part of this document story is that it was only rediscovered in 1979 when a high school intern was going through an old vault in the Philosophical Society, found a scroll rolled up with a red ribbon on it, realized, well, this is probably above my pay grade to open this, and decided to take it to the librarian's office, who unfurled it and realized that he had a national treasure on his hands. Now, I often got asked, so what happens? They raised all this money. What happened to this expedition? I've never heard of André Michaux or this expedition. And I'd usually summarize it by what we wrote on our old, what the APS wrote on their website. Ultimately, the expedition was called off due to diplomatic difficulties with France, which owned much of the territory to be explored. So I want you to remember this summary. Diplomatic difficulties with France is why it did not happen, and that they own much of the territory to be explored. This is important. So the story of how I came to write this book is this document had always fascinated me. And it was the pandemic. My life had gotten waylaid like everybody else. One of the things that also happened was I have 3 children. All of their soccer got canceled. So all of a sudden I had my evenings again. And I started thinking, well, I need something to do. And at almost the same time, the director of development at the APS said, hey, you know that document you always talk about, the Michaux subscription list? It'd be really interesting if you would give a talk about that subscription list at an event in California in September of 2020. And I said, this is great. I really would like to dive into this more to figure out what the whole story is behind this document. So as you know, September 2020, I probably did not travel to California. And instead of giving a 20-minute talk in San Francisco, I ended up writing a 400-page book. And I'm now here giving you a 40-minute talk about what I found. So that was the spark for the book. It was supposed to be a talk. And I wanted to arrange the talk around these 4 questions. And these are the 4 questions that end up forming the core of the book. So who was André Michaux? And what is the real story of the subscription list? And what really happened? And probably most importantly, did it matter? What's the legacy? And so I want to share with you now some of the findings that I uncovered during my expedition, if you will, into the past. But if you want the full answers, I understand there's a book signing afterwards out in the hall. So who was André Michaux? Well, as Jamie mentioned, I think André Michaux is probably the greatest scientific explorer, a natural historian of his generation that you've never heard of before. In fact, there is no likeness of him. What you're looking at here is an image I found in the APS library in another French botanist's papers who just decided to sketch what a botanist would look like in the field conducting research. And so this was actually really helpful for me when I was trying to imagine Michaux and all these expeditions, because you can see here, I don't know if you can make it out, but he's got a gun over his shoulder. He's got a pickaxe in his right hand. He's got all of his treasure and specimen behind him. And this is how I pictured Michaux throughout the story. So I hope maybe you will too. So I'll tell you a little bit more about Michaux. Michaux was born in France in 1746. He was born outside of Versailles. So you're looking at Versailles here. He was born on an area called Sartori, which at the time were a number of farms. This was land that was owned by the King of France, who would then lease it out to individuals. And often these individuals had gained the favor and support of the king. And so if you had one of these farms, you could rely on a fairly lucrative income. Why? Because you fed Versailles, and there were a lot of mouths at Versailles all the time to feed. And any excess you had, you could then bring to market, and you could also feed your own family. Sartori is actually that forest down there on the bottom that is now forest. That was all farmland before. So you can get a sense of how close Michaux was to Versailles. Now, Michaud's father anticipated that his son would just follow in his footsteps. This is, monarchical, autocratic, hierarchical France. As far as he was concerned, this is a great living. It's an inheritance that he wanted to pass on to his son. And Michaux, for all intents and purposes, followed in his father's dreams, followed in his father's footsteps, and eventually took over the farm. And everything was going swimmingly for Michaux. And as you'll see, this is a theme in Michaud's life. Everything seems to be going really well. He marries. He has a young son named Francois André. And then the unexpected happens. Tragedy strikes. Michaud's wife dies just months after childbirth, leaving him a widower, a young single father. And most of all, what becomes clear in Michaud's life story is that he had a passionate love for his wife. And he never again, there's no record of him ever again finding a friend. And he's sent into this deep, dark, depressive abyss. There are accounts of his neighbors and his friends worried about Michaud, and they feared that he was going to do something drastic. And his friends are inviting him over for dinner. They're all trying to raise his spirits, and nothing seems to work until he's invited over to a botanist who was working at Versailles. And that botanist was working on that top area there. If you can see kind of a cross check that's brown. He invited Michaud over. He'd heard about Michaud. He understood Michaud had a farm. And he asked Michaud if he'd do him a favor. He'd received these new seeds from afar. And he wanted to see if Michaud could conduct an experiment to see if they would grow in French soil. Michaud agreed. And next thing he knew, the work consoled him and also consumed him. Michaud realized he had found his passion. He was a scientist, and this sparked that interest in him. And the botanist at Versailles realized that he had somebody who had incredible aptitude. Michaud blew him away with his ability to conduct this experiment. And soon he takes Michaud under his wing, and he becomes his protege. And after he spends a month in Versailles studying under him, he's sent to Paris to study at the Royal Garden there. And then they are so impressed with him, they send Michaud over to London to study in the botanical gardens in the UK. He returns from London, and he's sent out in some very early kind of apprenticeship, what are called botanizing expeditions. That's when a botanist goes out to conduct experiment in the Pyrenees Mountains. And then he returns to Paris, and he's hungry for adventure. He's hungry to prove who he is and what he can do. And that coincides in 1782 with the arrival or the departure of a diplomatic mission to the Middle East. The French are sending an envoy who are supposed to go to Baghdad to conduct diplomacy, to establish a consul. And Michaud lobbies to be appointed on this expedition. And the crown, Marie Antoinette in particular, agrees to underwrite his cost to the Middle East. And so Michaud spends 3 years traveling throughout the Middle East. He travels all the way up to the Caspian Sea, and then he returns to Paris, and he returns laden with all of these treasures. He carries back with him, he's the person that's believed to be the first person to create a French to Persian dictionary. He carries back something called the Michaux stone. And I read about this Michaux stone, and it was described as 50 pounds, and it had this kind of ancient hieroglyphics on it that nobody could interpret. Nobody could actually crack it until the mid-19th century, but everybody knew it was valuable because it had some sort of data on it. Well, I went to Paris to conduct research and to kind of walk in Michaud's footsteps, and they had the stone out. This stone was only about this big, but it was 50 pounds, which is pretty incredible. And he has hundreds of new specimens and seeds. He arrives back at the court of France, and they're blown away by him. And King Louis XVI decides to appoint Michaud as his royal botanist. And Michaud thinks, oh, this is great. I finally made it. I can now establish myself as a botanist. I'm going to have a steady stream of income, and I can pursue botany however I wish. And the king says to him, I don't think so. And he says, what do you mean? Michaux says, I've just traveled to the Far East, and I've actually seen, there is so much more in Asia to discover. I want to go there. The environment can be similar to France. I can find all these new treasures there to bring back. And the king says, no. I have different plans for you, young man. You are to head west. Travel across the Atlantic Ocean to the United States. Why? There are several reasons that the king decided to send Michaux over to the United States. Michaux agrees to, of course. He is under the patronage of the King of France. At the time, France, this is the first time France had really had access to Eastern North America. And it offered an incredible amount to the French. So first off, as many of you probably know, France had just fought almost 30 years of constant warfare. The 7 Years' War, also known as the French and Indian War, followed by the American Revolution, the support of the United States during the American Revolution. And as a result, the French forests were largely depleted. They had depleted their forest in order to provide their military, especially the Navy, with the stores necessary to sustain these wars. And so the king said to Michaux, I need you to go to the United States and try and discover American oats that are hardy enough that can be planted in France so we can replenish our forests. The other the other objective was that because the British controlled Eastern North America for so long, French scientists had largely not had access to that area. And the French were hopeful that there were all these crops and plants and even animals that could be exported from the United States and imported into France that would transform French agriculture to strengthen their economy, but also to provide greater sustenance for those in France. This was a period of time in which famine remained a real threat. And they believed that there were crops in America that could be sent to France and imported into their soil and transform French agriculture. And then the third objective, which was actually the one Michaux had the most interest in, was to find new plants that were incredibly beautiful. And so that was the third objective that Michaux had. So Michaux travels across the Atlantic Ocean in 1785. He arrives in New York City. This is where they think he's going to open up his first botanical garden. And he meets a number of New Yorkers, and he immediately realizes this is not the place for him. Why are you all laughing? I haven't even got to the punchline yet. He writes, and this is a quote, that New York City people are cold and only care about money, not science. And so he starts to explore other areas of the country. The other thing that he's frustrated with is he does not find the horticulture, the plant life that he's looking for in this expedition. So he starts traveling around North America to try and find a different spot. And of course, one of the places he visits is Virginia. He's carrying with him letters of introduction from Lafayette and others. And he finds himself at Mount Vernon to meet George Washington. He and George Washington spend a night together. Washington is taken with Michaux. It's one of those stories where, as far as we can tell, Washington had no idea Michaux was going to show up on his doorsteps. But he shows up and he's carrying a letter of introduction from Lafayette. So of course, Washington's going to invite him in. And then Washington hears all these stories about the Middle East that Michaux is regaling him with. And he says, if you need any help, if you want to use Mount Vernon as a site for experimentation, I can give you some area if you'd like it. So they really hit it off. And Michaux eventually sends Washington a number of pistachio nuts and other plants that Washington plants. Well, as he's traveling throughout North America, he eventually lands in Charleston, South Carolina. And he realizes that Charleston, South Carolina provides him with the base that he wants to work from. And so he opens a botanical garden in Charleston, South Carolina. At about the same time, he also opens a second garden in New Jersey. It's a smaller garden in New Jersey. He has 110 acres, 111 acres in South Carolina. So by 1785, André Michaux, this Frenchman, has opened 2 large botanical gardens in North America, one in New Jersey that actually took an act of the New Jersey state legislature to create because foreigners were not allowed to own any land at the time. But in recognition of the French support for the American Revolution, they decided to allow Michaux to open a garden. and then 110 acres from Charleston, South Carolina, which served as Michaux's base of operations. And as you can see here, Michaud, from that South Carolina hub, took a number of expeditions throughout North America. The way his pattern was basically every spring, he would launch an expedition to a new area, return, and then spend the fall and winter months taking those plants and those specimens, planting them, cultivating them, and keeping up with his scientific work. And here you can see he traveled through Florida. He went to the Bahamas. Everything is going swimmingly for Michaud. He may have been reluctant to come to the United States, but after a couple of years, he is completely smitten with the United States. This is where he is making incredible discoveries. He's writing back to France. He ends up sending 50,000 living specimens across the Atlantic Ocean to France. It's really remarkable. But going back to that pattern in Michaud's life, where everything seems to be going well until it isn't anymore, and he's completely waylaid by events outside of his control. As we all probably know, eventually the French Revolution happens. By 1791, the king has been deposed. He is no longer able to fund Michaud's expeditions. Michaud himself has run out of his own personal money. He's in dire financial straits. He's going to former bankers and financiers in Charleston and Boston and New York City, trying to find somebody who would keep him in the United States. South Carolina goes so far. They know how desperate Michaud is and how vital the work he is doing is. South Carolina offers him citizenship. They will give him citizenship if he'll stay in the United States, and they will fund his garden. He refuses because he refuses to become an American citizen. He may like the United States, but he is a Frenchman first and foremost. So Michaud is in dire straits. He decides that, the best thing for him is to get, in fact, one of the funny stories is he receives a letter from his supervisor in France, and he says, "We can't support you anymore. It's time for you to come home. You have to end this project." And Michaud, he writes to a friend, he says, "I just pretended I never received that letter." So we may be able to relate to that in some respects. So finally he goes, what can I do? I've got to get out of Charleston. So he starts selling some of his property. In fact, he starts to sell some of those he'd enslaved to fund a major expedition, an expedition all the way up to the Hudson Bay. So Michaud takes an expedition, just him and 3 Native American guides travel all the way up to almost the Hudson Bay and back. And Michaud arrives back in the United States. It's now the winter of December of 1792. And he knows that he's going to be recalled again. And he's trying to think, what can I do to stay here? And he looks at this map and he looks at all of his expeditions and he realizes, I've done a lot of Eastern North America, but I haven't yet crossed that Mississippi River and gone all the way to the Pacific Ocean. And since he's just successfully done this Hudson Bay expedition, he has the confidence, he believes that he can successfully do a transcontinental expedition with just 3 or 4 Native American guides. And so he thinks, well, if I want to do this, how can I do this? And he realizes there's the American Philosophical Society. Michaud had become very close through his scientific work with many members of the American Philosophical Society, which was this incredible scientific organization. The greatest thinkers were at the Philosophical Society, people like William Bartram, Benjamin Smith Barton, Thomas Jefferson, David Rittenhouse. Benjamin Franklin was the founder of the society and its first president. So this was a scientific center. It was similar to the French Academy of Sciences, which Michaud knew about. So he arrives in December of 1792 in Philadelphia. He meets with a group of APS members and he says, "I have a great idea for you. I want to travel across this continent. I will make discoveries that you can't even imagine, discoveries that will be useful to the United States and to mankind. And I will share with you my discoveries if you underwrite this expedition." And the APS members say, we've heard this idea before. Have you ever heard of Thomas Jefferson? He's been talking about doing this for almost a decade. As early as 1783, Jefferson had been trying to fund a transcontinental expedition. In fact, in 1783, he reached out to George Rogers Clark, the conqueror of the West, to see if Clark would undertake an expedition to the Pacific Ocean. He tried to raise money, particularly through the Virginia government, but he couldn't receive any funding, so it died. 1791-92, he'd approached the APS. He said, "Do you think we can raise the money through the APS to do this?" The APS tried to reach out and find somebody who could undertake this expedition. One of the people that they broached the idea with was Meriwether Lewis. Jefferson said he didn't think Lewis was up to the task. By the time, he probably wasn't. But he meets André Michaux. These members say, you've got to meet Thomas Jefferson. You've got to talk to him. Jefferson hears this idea, but he also hears about the expeditions Michaux has undertaken. He's heard about this incredible expedition to the Middle East where Michaux had confronted, he had been robbed, he had fought off pirates, he had encountered dangerous animals, horrendous weather. He had heard about his travels to the Hudson Bay with just 3 or 4 Native American guides. He realizes if somebody is going to undertake this expedition successfully, it is André Michaux. And he also realizes Michaux might provide him with the cover necessary to succeed. Because at the time, Jefferson is acutely aware of the tensions that have developed between the United States and Native American communities, especially those in the Ohio and points west, who are fearful that this new country is just an aggrandizing power that is going to colonize and subjugate them. And Jefferson's very worried that if he sends an American envoy out there, they're going to assume that's what's going on. So he thinks that if I can send a Frenchman out there, this won't look as suspicious. So Jefferson, with this idea, decides to try and raise the money for real. And that's what the subscription list is all about. The society successfully raises the equivalent of $1.75 million to underwrite this expedition. The society creates a number of committees to do this. And after they successfully raise the money, they decide to create a third committee, a committee that was going to outline the mission, the purpose, the priorities that Michaux should have as he travels west. And at the head of this new committee, it's the luminaries of American science. It's got Benjamin Rush on it. It's got somebody named Caspar Wistar. It's got Thomas Jefferson. It's got David Rittenhouse. They decide to write instructions to Michaux. And what you're looking at here, once again in Thomas Jefferson's hands, and this is held by the APS library, are the instructions to André Michaux. Now, these are very long, detailed instructions, but I want to highlight what their priorities are for Michaux. So the first priority, and this is emphasized time and again in these instructions, they observe to you that the chief objects of your journey are to find the shortest and most convenient route of communication between the U.S. and the Pacific Ocean. How quickly can we reach the Pacific Ocean? This is about communication. This is about trade. This is about commerce. They want to find the fastest route to the Pacific, not to explore, the fastest route to the Pacific. And then, if you're to find any animals, we really want you to find a mammoth. And if you have a chance, we also want you to find a llama. Now, the reason they do this is very important. I'm happy to talk about it later. But the point I want to make here is, think about who André Michaux was. He was a botanist. When he first was appointed the royal botanist, he said to the king, I want to travel to Asia to pursue science for its own sake. And now he's got a bunch of Americans telling him to find the fastest route so the United States can have greater commercial access to the Pacific and to find a mammoth and a llama. So Michaux and the APS get into this. Actually, one other little fun fact. Jefferson also tells Michaux, or the instructions tell Michaux, that he should keep a journal, just like Lewis and Clark did, but also to make sure that the most important information is tattooed on his skin. In the event that if he were to die and his body returned, they would have access to that knowledge, or if he were to lose his journals, he would have it and not lose it. So Michaux hears this and he writes, and the APS has this correspondence. He says, no, this is not the plan. I want to travel on my own accord. I'm going to explore. I'm pursuing natural history for its own sake. I am not willing to be an employee, essentially, of the APS. He's particularly worried about how this might be perceived in France. If he's getting paid by the APS and pursuing U.S. interest, how are the French going to interpret his actions? I should remind you, this is also the time where a lot of people are losing their heads. So they are locked in negotiations. They come to loggerheads. There's a total stalemate. And then, once again, in Michaux's life, an unexpected event completely redirects them. This man arrives in Philadelphia. Can anybody recognize him? Who said that? Edmund Genet. This is the first diplomatic representative of the French revolutionary government to arrive in the United States. He arrives in Charleston to great fanfare. He arrives in Philadelphia. He is there to advocate for the French Revolution. His objective is try to convince the United States, especially their citizens, to support the French Revolution. This is a time in which the French Revolution itself is a great controversy. The United States is challenged with how to deal with the French Revolution. The French are looking to the United States as their allies. They say, hey, didn't we support you during your revolution? This is a sister revolution. You should be supporting us. At the same time, the British, the Spanish, the European monarchies see the French Revolution as this great threat to tradition and their institutions. So the French are at war with Great Britain and Spain. And here in Philadelphia, George Washington, the President of the United States, is struggling with how to navigate this foreign policy dilemma. His heart, in some respects, is with the French Revolution, though he's very concerned about the way things are unfolding in Paris at this very moment. At the same time, he exercises realpolitik. He knows that this is a very dangerous period of time for the United States. Its foundations are extraordinarily fragile. And if it were to enter into a conflict allied with France, then Great Britain could very easily take back North America. Their forts in the Northwest are well manned. They control the seas with the British Navy. And so Washington decides to issue a neutrality proclamation to say we are going to stay out of this conflict altogether, much to the frustration of the French, who feel like that is the United States turning their back on them. So Genet arrives in Philadelphia with the objective to try and convince American citizens to lobby the government to be more supportive of the French Revolution. He also carries with him secret instructions that he hopes will force the United States to side with France if they won't do so by their own convictions. He has secret instructions to mobilize angry frontiersmen in Kentucky to invade Louisiana, which is at the time controlled by Spain. Their belief is that if these frontiersmen invade New Orleans, take control of Spanish Louisiana, they will erect a republic, an independent republic aligned with France. And most importantly, those in Europe will consider this an act of the United States, not a group of independent, rabble-rousing Kentuckians. All right. And so Genet arrives in Philadelphia with these instructions. And within days of arriving in Philadelphia, he meets André Michaux. And he says, oh, André, so you're planning to go out west. Is Kentucky on that route? You seem to be a scientist, and everybody thinks you're a scientist. Is there any way you might go out there and meet with some Kentucky frontiersmen and see if they'll do this invasion? Michaux, the loyal Frenchman that he is, agrees, much to his, he was, again, once again, extraordinarily reluctant. Even Genet writes about, I don't think he really wanted to do it, but he was very loyal to France, and he did it. And so Genet and Michaux construct a plan to travel out to Kentucky, in which Michaux is going to travel under the guise of science. Some people may be aware of this project with the APS. And when he goes out to Kentucky, he's to meet George Rogers Clark. That person Jefferson had approached years ago for the transcontinental expedition. At the time, George Rogers Clark was frustrated with the lack of support that he had received from the U.S. government after the American Revolution. And he had indicated he was willing to renounce his allegiance to the United States and conduct an invasion of Spanish Louisiana if he received the support of the French government. So Genet decides this is a great plan, but I need some special cover for Michaux. And he becomes very close friends with Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson, as you probably know, in this debate about the French Revolution, Jefferson is a great supporter of the French. He's a great supporter of the French Revolution. He believes the United States should be more supportive of the French. So on July the 5th, 1793, Genet meets Jefferson at his house. Now remember, Jefferson is Secretary of State, but he is very close to Genet. And Genet decides that he can trust Jefferson, and he tells the Secretary of State this entire plot. And you can see here, this is Jefferson's notes on that meeting. And I've highlighted the key parts here. He said he communicated to me these things, not as Secretary of State, but as Mr. Jefferson, meaning he was talking to him as a friend, not in an official capacity. He asked me to write a letter of introduction. I took back the letter and I wrote another one exactly as Janae had asked him to do. So now André Michaux has a letter of introduction from the Secretary of State, in which the Secretary of State is saying, this is a botanist traveling to conduct science. Please allow him to travel freely throughout your state and meet with people. He should not be under any suspicion. Yeah, let that sink in for a second. This is the Secretary of State. I would compare this to as if the Secretary of State knew when Russia was going to invade Ukraine and decided not to say anything to their administration. So what happens? Michaux ends up going out to Kentucky, and I know we're short on time, so I'll summarize very quickly. Michaux travels out, and if you want to know the full story, that's the book in the lobby. This is all part of my plan. So Michaux successfully travels out to Kentucky. He meets George Rogers Clark. Clark manages to raise troops of over 2,000 men. They create their own uniforms. They muster, they train. There are reports that the iron forges in Kentucky are burning brighter, smelting cannons for the invasion. They build a whole flotilla of boats that are tasked with traveling down the Mississippi River for the invasion. They have plans. Everybody's talking about it. And everything looks like the launch is going to happen in the spring of 1793 or 4. But then the Spanish catch wind of what's happening. They're able to keep this largely secret. Just in Kentucky, it's pretty remarkable. But there's a Spanish spy who's part of this and leaks this information to the Spanish ambassador stationed in Philadelphia. That Spanish ambassador immediately goes to, yes, I hear the Jefferson, the Secretary of State. Isn't that who you tell about this plot? Jefferson says, oh my God, he reports it to Washington, says, you can't believe what's happening out west. And Jefferson writes all these stern letters to the governor that you've got to tamp this down. It creates a huge crisis for Washington. It's a crisis in his presidency that isn't well studied. I talk a lot about it in the book. But what Washington is really trying to sort out is what is the executive empowered to do in a situation like this? Does he have the authority to tamp down this potential rebellion? Does he have the authority to use the U.S. Army that is stationed out there to clamp this down? He isn't certain. There's cabinet debates about it. Some think the president doesn't. Some think the local states have the authority and the right to do so. Ultimately, Washington decides that he does have the authority to order the U.S. Army to tamp this down if it's necessary. And the reason he says is because his number one duty is to protect the United States Constitution. This invasion, if successful, could fundamentally undermine not just his administration, but the republic itself. Now, it never comes to that because he issues a number of very stern proclamations. Arthur St. Clair is the governor out there who makes it clear that the federal government means business, that they're going to arrest people, they're going to be tried, they could even be executed. And so it kind of just dissipates, and that this rebellion never comes to pass. And I have to tell you, this is kind of an anticlimactic ending to the story. It was challenging for me as a historian and as author to say, wow, I was sucked into this story and it all just ends. So that is that fourth question I told you about. Who was André Michaux? What's the story of the subscription list and the story behind it? What really happened, which was clearly far more to the story than the original website said, but did it really matter? And there I was blown away with all the ways I found that it did. So let me just share with you some of the lasting legacies of this story, this conspiracy. So first, what is the legacy of André Michaux? So Michaux in North America ends up discovering over 1,000 new species of plants. He has a remarkable record of discovery, of botanizing work, but it doesn't just end in the United States. What ends up happening is he has to go back to Paris eventually. And in Paris, he decides to take another expedition. And as you can see here, he goes through Africa. He ends up in Madagascar, where he realizes the biodiversity in Madagascar is even more impressive than what he saw in the South. And he decides to create another botanical garden in Madagascar. Once again, things are going swimmingly for Michaux, but this time tragedy strikes, this time the most severe of all tragedies. He is stricken with some sort of local virus and he dies in Madagascar. But for those in the field of botany, Michaux looms very large. He is credited with over 1,000 new species of plants. The legacies at the APS, this to me is one of the more interesting parts of the story. It's something I didn't know about, some of it. So first off, the spirit that animated the APS in 1793 continues to animate the institution today. The society has always been pushing the boundaries of knowledge. In 1803, during the Lewis and Clark expedition, when Jefferson finally succeeds in realizing this vision, the first thing he does is he tells Meriwether Lewis, go to the APS and meet with their scientists so you can learn scientific medical treatments that you're going to need on this expedition. So the APS was essential to the launch of the Lewis and Clark expedition. Today, we are the stewards of the Lewis and Clark journals. Perhaps even more notably, in the instructions that Jefferson wrote for Lewis and Clark, he used these instructions for Michaux as his first draft. And the editors of the papers of Thomas Jefferson have shown that there are verbatim copies of language from this in the instructions to Lewis and Clark. So it's clear this was by his side, and he was referring back to it as he wrote out those instructions for Lewis and Clark. And today, the society, in that same spirit of Michaux and Lewis and Clark, continues to fund research around the world. You can see there that we've funded research on over 7 continents, again, spurring new discoveries through the work of botanists, expeditions, and other types of field work. The final thing is the legacies for the United States. And this was perhaps my most surprising discovery, which is I started this own expedition into the past by asking about this document. And little did I know that a question about this document would take me to the Middle East, would take me to the Hudson Bay, would take me to a conspiracy that threatened the foundations of the United States and the early republic, and ultimately to a question about citizenship. And this is probably the finding that most surprised me, because citizenship at this time, it was an undefined idea. Everybody in the United States, most people in the United States had been subjects before the American Revolution. This idea of being a citizen was a new concept. And so just as Washington was trying to figure out what authority do I have as an executive, so too were Americans saying, what does this idea of citizenship mean? And one of the things that emerged during this conspiracy is that those in Kentucky had a very different idea of citizenship than those in Philadelphia, especially people like Washington and many of the founders had. We were able to see in the arguments, those in Kentucky had to justify their action. And what they said time and again is that citizenship ends at the borders of the country. As soon as an American citizen leaves the United States, they are not bound by any laws or obligations to this country. They are basically an independent citizen of the world. And for Washington, he said, no, we have policies. People have to be bound by the policies of the United States. And so in 1795, Washington, along with Congress, and this is at the period of the first party system where there's incredible partisan divide within the United States, agree that they have to pass a law that further clarifies the duties, obligations, and limitations on citizenship, making it clear that Americans cannot conduct the type of efforts that George Rogers Clark and others did in Kentucky, that would be against the law, that citizens have to be bound by the policies and laws of the United States wherever they are. So little did I know that exploring this one document would lead me on a journey to something as fundamental and essential to our country today as the meaning of citizenship. And for me, that is what doing history is all about. That's why places like this exist. I mean, think about, this is the story of one document unraveling this incredible story. And at the APS, we have 14 million pages of documents. There's an incredible treasure trove here at the Virginia Historical Museum of History and Culture. Just think about how many more stories are resting in our archives, waiting to be told. Thank you.
Was Kentucky a state at this point?
Yes, it had just been made a state, and it's basically the first governor, Isaac Shelby. So a big part of the story is that those in Kentucky are arguing what it means to be a state. What powers do the state have? And as you know, there's a growing states' rights mentality that's developing in Kentucky, as recognized in the resolves. A year after all this, there are a number of conventions that are held in which many of the people involved in this conspiracy write petitions arguing to the federal government that they need greater support, and if not, they will become perhaps independent. A lot of threats about independency. So they had just been made a state, and that's a big part of this story as well.
What happened to his son, Michel André Michaux?
Thank you. Yeah, I never know how much I can tell because I was watching my watch here. So yeah, Francois André Michaux. This is great. You're going to get me to tell something I always like to tell, but I couldn't. So Francois André Michaux, when Michaux goes to the Middle East, he decides his son is too young. So he puts him with his sisters who care for him. When Michaux goes to North America, Francois André is now a teenager, and he wants his son to follow in his footsteps, just like his father wanted him to follow in his footsteps. Michaux, of course, decided to go his own path. So André is with him at his side for much of this period of time. He's involved in a very serious accident in which his eye is struck with a bullet, and it looks like his eye may be lost. And so Michaux tries to treat him. Anybody guess what the best way in the 1790s was to treat a wound that's infected in your eye? Bleed yourself, right? That's the way to treat the eye. So he almost loses his eye. He's sent back to Paris, where he receives a medical treatment. His eye is saved. Francois André follows in his father's footsteps. He returns to the United States and becomes an incredible botanist himself. He travels all the areas that his father traveled. He publishes a number of books. If you've heard the name Michaux, it's perhaps because his son published a journal that has travels to the United States. When his son, Francois André, dies, there is no Michaux left. And so Francois André decides to give the entire estate to the American Philosophical Society. So the society received this incredible gift in the late 19th century, and they said, what should we do with this corpus? How can we use it? And we should use it to serve the idea of Michaux and Francois André. And Francois André was a member of the APS. So they said, what can we use this for? It's interesting. At this period of time in the United States, because of the Industrial Revolution, the United States itself had now gone through its own deforestation. And this is the very early days of the forestry movement, the desire to conserve the natural environment in the United States. And so the APS decides to use this fund to hire a lecturer to travel around Pennsylvania advocating for preserving forest in the state, which really had been denuded, the landscape, because of both farming, industrial revolution. And so this lecturer would go around, and the historians have written about this, and he started off with a very small audience, maybe 2 or 3, and then it grew larger and larger because he was this incredibly gifted lecturer. And after several years, the state creates the Department of Forestry, and they appoint him the first director of forestry. And the state, and he then, in honor of Francois André Michaux, decides to name the first state forest Michaux State Forest in Pennsylvania in recognition of those funds that were used to support this endeavor. Thank you for that question.
If Andre was royal botanist, obviously he was working for the French king. Well, when the French king was overthrown by the revolutionists, how did they have any authority over Michaux to be able to call him home?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So basically Michaux needed money. And I write about this in the book. So Michaux, people have asked me in the past, well, did Michaux support the French Revolution or not? He probably supported the French Revolution, but he wasn't there at the center of it. But we've seen in his writing, he received patronage from the crown. He knew how to perform that art. He relied on the government for funding. Without the French government, whether it was the crown or the revolutionary government, he needed their support. And so his goal with the deposition of the king was actually to get reappointed by the French revolutionary government to receive funding for them to continue on in the United States. And he could have stayed in the United States, but that's the part where you can really see above all else, Michaux is a loyal Frenchman. And so he wants to get the support of the French government. He's pretending that he's still working for the French government because he hopes that by doing so, he can then say, look, I'm serving you, now you got to pay me. And in fact, one of the things he's constantly negotiating is, can he get a formal appointment? Can he start getting paid again? And the reason he returns to Paris is because the money never comes. Also, the other reason he decides to return to Paris is he is determined to do this transcontinental trip across the United States. And he and his friends in the United States, especially those in Philadelphia, they say to him, Andre, we'd love you to do this, but let's be honest, you're probably not going to make it back. You've got to go to Paris and publish all that you found and make sure your herbarium, that's where these 1,000 new species are documented, take that herbarium and save it somewhere for posterity. You've got to go back and do that. And so Michaux agrees with the idea that he's going to go back to the United States and do this, hopefully with some funding from the French government. The fact is, one of the things you realize about Michaux is that he's driven, he's determined. His friends describe him as a stoic who only talks science. You know, in his letters, there's not a lot of personality that comes out. You can just see him as this very driven person. But he loves expeditions and botanizing. He struggles with publishing. And so for years, he's trying to publish. He can't publish. He's in financial straits. And that's actually why he goes off to Africa and never returns again. So I took that in a little different of a direction, but I wanted to share that as well.
When you talked about the citizen going from a subject to citizenship, are you referring to the 14th Amendment?
No. That's later. Before the American Revolution, most colonists were considered subjects of the crown, which meant you paid your obedience and loyalty not just to the British Parliament, but most importantly to the British King. So they were subjects. You were, subject to the king, underneath the king. The idea of citizenship, which is born out of the democratic revolution, the American Revolution, and the creation of a republic, is the idea that in some ways you all are equal citizens, equal individuals under this government. The idea is the term citizen is what is used to describe that new political conception of the individual, that they're a citizen, not a subject to a crown. You're independent of that. And in fact, the idea of citizenship really sweeps across the Atlantic Ocean, because after the French Revolution, those in France start describing themselves as citizens. And some people start describing themselves as citizens of the world, that they no longer are subject, in fact, to any country, but that this is this transnational category of individuals who all share the same values.
Okay, I think that's going to be all we have time for tonight. So if you'll all join me in giving our speaker another round of applause for a fantastic talk. And Patrick's going to be in Commonwealth Hall shortly after the lecture, where you can enjoy a reception, purchase copies of the book, and answer any more questions that you might have. Thank you for your support.
Great. Thank you all.